Don't rush this one. Every part of this story carries a truth, and the last piece will only make sense if you've walked through it all. If even a single moment speaks to you, hold on to it and share it in the comments. Someone else might need those words too. When you say no and don't explain, the game shifts. He said no, that was all. No smile, no softness, no explanation. Just two letters and silence. The other person blinked, surprised. They waited, expecting the usual, maybe a reason, a story, a polite exit strategy. But nothing came. And in that moment of stillness, the balance of control changed, not loudly, but definitively. Machiavellian psychology doesn't view no as resistance. It sees it as restructuring. When you stop explaining yourself, you stop negotiating your value. You remove the debate. You and the performance. Power doesn't announce itself. It redefines the rules, quietly. And nothing rewrites a social dynamic faster than a calm refusal without a footnote. This wasn't a power move with flair. It was cleaner than that. A recalibration. One that didn't require confrontation. Only the absence of concession. He didn't feel victorious. He felt blank. But that blankness wasn't a lack. It was space. For the first time, he wasn't reacting, adjusting, explaining. He was just standing, still, clear, unavailable. What people fear most isn't your no. It's your no without access. When they can't argue, persuade, guilt, or decode you, they lose the game they didn't even know they were playing. Because explanation is a form of currency, and the moment you stop paying it, you stop being bought. And he saw it, in the way the other person paused, recalculated, then retreated. They didn't push. They couldn't. Because no, with no handle, is a door that doesn't open, no matter how many times they knock. This was his first move. Not towards rebellion, but towards sovereignty. A shift not in tone, but in posture. The kind that tells the world, you don't get access by default anymore. Sometimes your empathy is just fear in a polite mask. He used to think he was a good listener, that he was simply considerate, kind, emotionally available. But the truth was colder. He wasn't being kind. He was being careful, carefully avoiding conflict, carefully absorbing discomfort, carefully disappearing into other people's needs so they wouldn't question his own. Every time someone asked something of him, he nodded before thinking. A request, a favor, a sudden obligation, and his body would already lean forward before his mind even registered the cost. The yes came from his throat like a conditioned reflex. Not because he agreed, but because saying yes was safer than what might happen if he didn't. Machiavellian psychology doesn't confuse emotional intelligence with surrender. It separates clarity from guilt. And what he thought was compassion was, in fact, a tactical error. He gave power away, transaction after transaction, in the name of being understood. He wasn't reading people. He was bracing for their reactions. That's not empathy. That's anticipation rooted in fear. There was a time, years ago, when someone insulted him in front of others. He smiled, not because it didn't hurt, but because confronting it might have caused a scene. Later, he told himself, I understood where they were coming from. But deep down, he didn't forgive, he just folded. That's what happens when guilt is mistaken for empathy. Your nervous system becomes a diplomat, smoothing every tension at the expense of your authority. Your inner boundaries become negotiable. Your identity becomes optional. And the people around you, especially the controlling ones, sense it. Because predators don't seek violence first. They seek compliance. And if you've trained yourself to say yes to everything, under the banner of understanding, you become a tool in their hands. He started noticing it in his body. The tightening in his throat every time he wanted to say no. The micro-freeze when someone pushed a little too far. The exhaustion after interactions that looked friendly on the surface, but left him emptied. He once believed this exhaustion meant he had helped someone. But now he knew. It meant he had abandoned himself again. So when he paused, when he didn't nod right away, when he finally held his ground without adding a smile, the silence was louder than any argument. And in that silence, something cracked. Not a rebellion, but a shift in internal loyalty. From them to himself. Control doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it smiles and decides for you. He had a friend who always took the lead. Chose the restaurant, set the time, made the plans, with a smile. It seemed generous, like a relief. Why argue, why complicate? It felt easier to follow. And so he did. Until one day, he realized he'd followed so often, he'd forgotten where he was going. It didn't look like control. It looked like charisma. But control rarely arrives in a uniform. Often, it comes dressed as comfort. And you comply not because you're weak, but because it's disguised as ease. Machiavellian thinking warns about this kind of influence, the kind that doesn't force, but frames. The one who sets the terms silently holds the power. The one who decides without needing to ask doesn't need to dominate. They simply arrange things so you forget you had a choice. He remembered the moment it snapped. They were headed to yet another place he didn't choose. His friend was talking, laughing, moving through the world with confidence. And he, polite, agreeable, present, felt his spine soften again. Not out of respect, but out of habit. That's how roles are formed. Not declared, but practiced. The quiet one. The flexible one. The one who always says, I don't mind. But every, I don't mind, is a small betrayal. And over time, they accumulate into silence. Into someone who stops even asking himself what he wants. And then one night, he didn't go. No lie, no apology. Just a quiet decision. He let the message hang. Not coming. The friend didn't reply. But the silence said it all. The rules had changed. Because when you stop showing up for someone else's structure, you start building your own. That was the first time he understood leadership isn't just about direction. It's about who defines the frame. And when you reclaim your choices, you remove the frame entirely. Hook. You didn't choose your role. You adapted into it. He was always the reliable one. The closer. The fixer. The guy who stayed late and said yes when others stepped back. At work, it earned him recognition. In conversations, people said, you're just built different, solid. It sounded like respect. But it wasn't. Because respect without limits becomes exploitation in a suit. He didn't choose the role. The role chose him, subtly, gradually, until it felt like his nature. He wasn't asked. He was expected. And because he delivered, they never questioned how much it cost. At first, it seemed like value. But it was a trap dressed in praise. A performance so convincing, even he believed it. That's how roles work. You wear them long enough, they start to feel like your skin. And the longer you stay in them, the more invisible your real needs become, to others, and worse, to yourself. Machiavellian wisdom reminds us, roles are most dangerous when they reward you for silence. When they give you status in exchange for compliance. When your usefulness becomes your identity. And once that happens, you're not being respected, you're being managed. The image came to him clearly one evening. He was tightening his tie before a late meeting, the fifth one that week. He didn't want to go. He wasn't even needed. But he went. Because someone had to hold it together. In that moment, he saw the symbol for what it was. The tie wasn't professionalism. It was a leash he'd learned to fasten himself. The role was not imposed by force. It was offered through habit. And he had accepted it, not because it fit, but because it helped him avoid the one thing he feared more than exhaustion, disapproval. He had learned early that value comes from usefulness. That being easy to count on was the currency of worth. But now, the cost was visible. In his shoulders, in his sleep, in the silence he carried at the end of every week. So he did something small, but precise. One task came in, and he said no. No delay, no reason. Just, I won't be taking that on. The response was confusion, then resistance, then recalibration. He had shifted the terms. And in that shift, he felt it, the break from costume. The moment when usefulness no longer equaled submission. The refusal not to play the part, even if it meant no applause. As any strategist knows, power is never in the role. Power is in the person who can remove the role and still stand. They misunderstood him. Again, twisted his words into something they weren't. Assumed his intent, filled in their own narrative, and looked at him, waiting, as if he owed them clarity. As if their misreading deserved his energy. And for the first time, he gave them nothing. No explanation. No defense. No subtle correction to help them reframe. He simply looked, calm, still, and let their version stand. Not because it was right, but because it no longer mattered. This was a shift so small it wouldn't register to most. But inside him, something massive moved. The old reflex, the one that rushed to fix misunderstandings, to repair assumptions, to justify behavior, had gone quiet. And in its place, space. Quiet, strategic space. Machiavelli would call it energy preservation. Because not every battle needs correction. In fact, some accusations are designed to bait explanation, because explanation makes you visible, soft, predictable. But when you stay silent, when you let the error hang, you become unreadable. And the unreadable can't be controlled. He remembered how, for years, he'd treated misunderstanding like a threat. His instinct was to smooth, clarify, please. To make sure no one thought poorly of him. But every time he defended himself, he gave away a piece of structure. and taught others they were entitled to access his core. This time, he watched it differently. They misjudged him. They spoke for him. And he let it pass. He didn't agree. He didn't deny. He just refused to play. Because some people don't want the truth. They want submission. They want you to dance for your innocence. And when you don't, the silence becomes unbearable for them. There's a symbol for this moment. A closed window on a cold night. You're warm inside. You don't need to open it just because someone outside says they're confused by the fog. Their discomfort is not your duty. That day, he walked away from the conversation and didn't replay it in his head. No spiral, no imagined retorts, no mental rehearsals of what he should have said. Just silence and peace. Because power isn't the ability to explain yourself perfectly. It's the ability to choose when not to. The second time he said no, it wasn't quiet inside him. It wasn't clean. It wasn't calm. His voice held steady, but his hands didn't. His breath shortened. A single pulse ticked under his jaw. His body betrayed the weight of the moment. Because even truth feels unnatural when you've lived too long in agreement. This wasn't fear of the other person. It was the tremor of confrontation with himself. Because boundaries are not just decisions, they are thresholds. And the first time you cross them, even in your own favor, your nervous system sounds the alarm. He had learned to say yes as a reflex for safety. Approval was oxygen. Agreement was survival. Compliance meant connection. So now, this no, clear, direct, unapologetic, felt like stepping into an unlit room and hearing the door close behind you. But he didn't step back. A Machiavellian would say this. Change isn't supposed to feel like confidence. It's supposed to feel like detox. The body rejects unfamiliar power like a foreign substance. Muscles ache, palms sweat, thoughts race. But those are not symptoms of failure. They are signs of exit. You're leaving the role. You're exiting the performance. And your body is adjusting to life without the mask. There was no applause. No immediate reward. Just silence. And underneath it, shaking. But it wasn't panic. It was recalibration. The inner software, once programmed to appease, was being rewritten in real time. He remembered how his hand subtly twitched after the moment passed. No one noticed. But to him, it was louder than a scream. And for the first time, he didn't run from the feeling. He stayed with it, sat in it, let it tremble through him. Because the body never lies. It keeps the score. It remembers every time you abandoned yourself. Every yes, that meant surrender. Every apology made just to keep the room warm. And now, it was unlearning, unhooking, unlocking. He stood in the bathroom mirror afterward, hands gripping the sink. No words, just breath. And in that breath, a shift, not dramatic, but grounded. He hadn't just said no to someone. He had said yes to his own presence. The symbol was clear now, a door once always open, slowly closing. Not slammed, not locked, just closed. Not to punish, but to define. And as he walked out of the room, something in his spine held. This is mine now.it was a simple message. A gathering. Familiar people. Same dynamic. The kind of event where you smile on cue, pour energy into conversations that lead nowhere, and walk away feeling slightly more hollow than before. He read the invitation and didn't respond. Not immediately. Not with a polite excuse or a maybe. He just sat with it. There was no conflict. No reason to decline. But this time, he didn't need one. Because the real decision wasn't about the event. It was about the pattern. All his life, he'd accepted these invitations automatically. Not because he wanted to be there, but because not being there felt like a threat to connection, to belonging, to peace. The fear wasn't about missing out. It was about being seen as distant, difficult, selfish. So he'd show up. Every time. On time. Smiling. Contributing. Performing. But now he paused. Closed his eyes. And asked a question no one had ever taught him to ask. Do I want to be there? The body answered first. Shoulders softened. Breath slowed. There was no anxiety, only clarity. And so he didn't go. Not to make a statement. Not to punish. Not to distance. But to reclaim space. A Machiavellian knows the power of absence. Strategic absence isn't withdrawal. It's an assertion, a subtle signal that your presence is not to be assumed, that your energy is no longer freely distributed. When you stop showing up to roles you never chose, people start questioning the structure they built around your silence. No one confronted him. A few noticed, a few didn't. But in the room where he wasn't, a chair was empty. And that absence whispered something louder than presence ever could. He stayed home, made tea, sat near a window. No noise, no social armor. And in that hour, something shifted, not around him, but inside him. The symbol, a chair, perfectly placed, untouched. Not because it was forgotten, but because it was reserved for him, by him. It was never about rejecting people. It was about choosing not to reject himself every time they asked for a piece of him. Because boundaries are not always built in battle. Sometimes, they're built in silence. When no one watches you choose yourself, the room was quiet. No messages, no invitations, no noise. Just him, alone. For most of his life, this kind of stillness would have felt like failure. Like abandonment. Like he had done something wrong. But not tonight. Tonight, he sat with a fullness he hadn't known before. A silence that didn't accuse, but embraced. A space where every answer was his. He thought about all the times he said yes, not out of alignment, but out of fear. The yes that drained him, that blurred his shape, that made him available to people who never truly saw him. He thought about all the times he explained, adjusted, apologized for existing in ways others didn't expect. And now, there was no one to perform for. The chair beside him was empty, but his spine was straight. He was no longer waiting for validation, negotiation, or rescue. He had stopped hoping someone else would build his boundaries for him. He had started drawing the map himself, with every no. A strategist would say, the most powerful position is not dominance, it's direction, knowing where you stand, and never letting others pull you from that position with the gravity of their expectations. So when the final silence came, not temporary, but earned, he welcomed it. The voice inside him was quiet, but unmistakable. Not loud, not aggressive, just real. It said, I am not available for anything that costs me myself. I am not obligated to answer what doesn't feel true. I am no longer dressing my fear as kindness. I don't go where I'm not choosing to be. And the symbol, the final one, was not a wall, not a locked door, not armor. It was a room with one chair, one light, and no need to explain anything to anyone. Because when the world stops asking, and you still know who you are, you've finally arrived.